Welcome everyone to an Ethical Corporation by Reuters events webinar on ESG going mainstream and the impact the current crisis of COVID-19 has had as well. I'm Ed Long, I head up our North American events at Ethical Corp. I hope you're all sitting comfortably from your home offices at the moment, and I hope you're all well. Environmental, social and governance information on companies is more so being utilised as a guide to the movement of capital. So ESG's going mainstream. Is this the end of short-termism, and what impact has COVID-19 had on the marketplace? I'm delighted today to welcome a fantastic panel of experts. Bear with me, I'm getting some warning signs coming up. That's good, all sorted. Sorry, we're at our limit already. Yeah, like I was saying, I'm delighted to welcome a fantastic panel of experts for today's webinar. Today joining us, we have Michael Kashani, who's the Global Head of ESG Portfolio Management for Fixed Income at Goldman Sachs. Catherine Banat, who's the Managing Director of Responsible Investing at RBC Global Asset Management. Nathan Fabian, Chief Responsible Investment Officer at PRI. Corey Klemmer, the Director of Engagement at Domini in Impact Investments. And today it will be moderated by Neil Stewart, who is the Director at Corporate Outreach at SASB. Firstly, thank you all for being a part of the webinar today and for joining us. Today's 1 hour webinar will be in the form of a panel discussion. On the right hand side, you'll see a box where you can post your questions. Please do post these across the hour and we'll aim to get these questions to the participants and answered for you. Today's been an incredibly popular webinar. We've had roughly around 3,000 people signing up, which is fantastic. Shows the appetite for the topic itself and the people wanting to hear from the great speakers we have today. So it really should make for an engaging discussion. To start things off, I'd like to just run a couple of polls just to understand firstly where you're signing in from today. So looking at what kind of type of business you're calling from, signing in from today. Just going to launch this for you. So we have, are you a corporate, an investor, an NGO, or other? So academic or an individual. Give you a couple of minutes couple of seconds to answer that. Okay, great. With 75% of you have voted. It's really a broad mix in terms of very much corporate and the investor and NGO perspective as well, and the other coming in there too. Bear with me. And just lastly as well, just like to ask, has your company signed on to the BRT statement on stakeholder capitalism? So that's a yes, a no, and an A. Great stuff. So that's 5 for yes, 36% for no, and a 59% for not applicable. Before I pass over to Neil to get the conversation underway, I'd just like to ask any of our panelists if they've got any thoughts on the responses to the two polls we've done today. Nope. Cool. All right. Well, in that case, it's my pleasure to hand over to Neil to get the discussion underway.
All right, Ed, thank you very much. Thanks for inviting SASB to be part of this. I'm excited to be working with this panel. So we have a double-barreled mission today, ESG gone mainstream and the impact of COVID-19. You know, it's a mark of just how fast the times are.
Is it Neil frozen for everyone else, or is it just me? Right. Okay. Cool.
Everyone.
Okay. Perfect. No worries.
There he is.
Just back. Perfect.
Pandemic on companies.
Can you come close more for
me? Could you just start again? Sorry, you froze and we lost you for a little while.
Sorry about that. Hopefully I'm back for good. It happens to sometimes the internet. I was saying that we'll structure this discussion into 3 parts. So start by looking at the state of play with ESG. We'll look at how you define sustainable investing, and you'll hear there's no one definition, there's no single style. Next, we'll move on to talking about the impact of COVID-19 on ESG, both thinking about the impact of the pandemic on companies, but also on capital markets. So whether it's specific ESG issues or on performance, we'll be talking about that. And as part of that, we'll look at the role of the Chief Sustainability Officer in helping companies get through this, really why the CSO should have a seat at the table. And the last part, part 3, we'll talk about recovery and the hope that it'll be recovery and reform, how we can build back better. We have to mobilize trillions of dollars of investment to dig out from COVID-19 and the recession that's coming, not to mention the climate crisis. So can ESG, can you, our audience, sustainability officers, help direct that flow of capital? So let's begin by meeting the panel and hearing how each one of their organizations defines and engages in sustainable investing. What's cool is that Ethical Corporation has really put together a panel with the key characters in this whole drama. The active manager in RBC, fixed income represented today by Goldman, classic SRI with Domini, and hopefully we're meant to be joined by BlackRock. Hopefully Ray will be here any second, representing the giant passive index manager, and then finally, like the glue holding them all together, the UNPRI. So maybe we could just go down the line and maybe start with Catherine Banat, Director of Responsible Investing, RBC Global Asset Management, known as an active manager. Maybe you could start by telling us how you define sustainable investing, how it's put into application at RBC. I think you're on mute, Kat.
There we go. Sorry, I got it confused. Blue versus not blue. Apologies. Good morning, everybody. Good morning, at least in New York City. Welcome, and thank you for joining us on a very complicated time of life. The definition of sustainable investing is obviously different for everybody. The core issue is focusing on long-term sustainability and the benefits of engaging with stakeholders beyond mere shareholders and looking towards the long term and how to create long-term value. We at RBC believe that active management helps us engage with companies and strategies that create a long-term view, both by reducing risk and generating long-term return. And throughout the panel, we'll talk a little bit about what more specifically that means in action.
Okay, good. And maybe go on to Michael. So turning out to fixed income, and ESG was not traditionally associated with fixed income investing. A lot of our audience is probably more used to equity investors. But what has changed, Michael?
Hello, and again, Echo, hope everyone is healthy and safe as well, and thank you for having me on. I think people were tired of being wrong. They saw the investing trends move away from them, and once we, as a community, I think an ESG or sustainability community, really define what ESG is, which is 2 lenses: ESG integration, fundamentally incorporating ESG considerations as part of your everyday analysis, portfolio construction. And then there is that opportunity to lean in or tilt portfolios if a strategy or a client dictates that. But I think it's really, it's convincing everyone that ESG was always mainstream. So sorry for changing the title of this panel, but it's always mainstream. Just people didn't realize it, and it took them being wrong a few times on their investments, on sectors, in order to really drive that home.
So I guess, and fixed income is one area where you can really, it really is stark. It's black and white. I mean, like when it comes to, say, a responsible loan or other kind of fixed income instrument. I mean, ESG is obviously a material risk, right, Michael?
Yeah, and I think that it also has the opportunity within fixed income to extend beyond corporates. We have sovereigns, we have our whole securitized space, we have munis in the US, and whether it be climate impacts and really come to realization that These issues need to be there. They need to be noted in the prospectus. Investors started to ask that question without knowing that they were asking ESG questions, at least some of the smart ones. But then having a complex around that, SASB being one of them, there are others, that really helps to define what should I be asking and should I be expecting a response? You know, are these material questions where management owes me a response? I think that's really been a fundamental shift within fixed income, the engagement element.
Excellent point. And we will talk a lot about engagement during this webinar. Going over to Corey Klemmer, our Director of Corporate Engagement at Domini Impact Investments. And so long before ESG hit the headlines, long before the term was even coined, there was socially responsible investing, or SRI, and there was Domini. It was one of the real pioneers. Now the word impact is part of your firm's name. Corey, give us your kind of set of definitions or parameters around the area of ESG and sustainable investing. Corey, I think you're on mute. Do you see a little red microphone that you can click? Still don't hear you, I'm afraid, Corey. Sorry. We'll come back to you in a second, Corey. Let me we'll chat with Nathan for a minute and then come back to you in a minute to hear more about how Domini approaches sustainable investing. But you know, Nathan, you're a Chief Responsible Investment Officer, PRI, and you've been a key actor in the development of definitions of labels, really, for sustainable investing. Taxonomy, Europe's green taxonomy, and maybe you could give us a quick update on that. Will the U.S. follow, and how important it is to put these kind of parameters and labels around sustainable investing?
Thanks, Neil. I think investors, after years of working on ESG, building the literacy, building the systems and the processes, are now trying to get deeper insights about what might happen in future in markets because of these environmental and social challenges. And the idea behind the taxonomy is to provide some metrics and thresholds for the level of emissions performance and energy performance in different sectors that are consistent with Paris Agreement climate goals. The basic idea being you can compare these performance metrics to, say, the emissions performance of your portfolio and see how much of a gap there is, because the gap starts to show you what kind of transition risk you might have to face in your portfolio in coming years. So this idea of looking forward is a really important development in ESG. This idea of using scenarios to do that, and then creating metrics that help us compare how the future might play out with progress or a shock even on an ESG issue. And the COVID crisis is a really interesting example of how a social issue can create a disruptive impact on markets. And we should, if there's time there, we should unpack that a little. But using tools like the taxonomy can help you basically understand how much transition risk you face and when it might hit. Will it be taken up in the US? It's interesting. I think the US is still thinking very much about using risk return in today's portfolio as the starting point to analyze ESG, rather than thinking about how might a goal or a transition pathway on an ESG issue leave my portfolio in future. And I think in parts of Europe, they are doing more of that longer term horizon planning and then working back from that goal. And that's a slightly different approach. So I think if we get a bit more forward-looking analysis, a bit more scenario planning happening in the US, then these types of tools like the taxonomy will be in more demand.
Maybe we could go back now to Corey. Can we hear you now? And could we learn about Domini and your approach to really the voice of the
I hope so. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Wonderful.
Corey.
Great. So thank you. And sorry, you never know what it's going to be. I thought it would be the leaf blowers, and my headphones gave out. I'm very glad for the opportunity to be here and to bring the kind of traditional SRI voice to this conversation. I think it's really important. As you referred to, our founder, Amy Domini, started Domini in the mid-90s, and before that, she launched the first, what is essentially the first ESG index with the KLD Social Index, and that was, when I was 5 years old. So we've been at this for a while. And the thesis has always been that companies with stronger environmental and social performance also perform better financially. But more fundamentally, the social and environmental systems that underpin the financial systems, we can't expect the financial system to succeed if we let either of those two systems fail. And we need companies that can succeed while supporting those systems, and ideally they're going to succeed by supporting those systems. And I think the current environment we find ourselves in really bears that out. As to the kind of definition of impact investing, and just, without taking up too much time, I think there's like a clear trajectory where this began with faith-based investors, divesting from napalm and apartheid, and responsible investing started as a screen, right? You just take out the 7 deadly sins or the things you don't want to be exposed to. It evolved to then integrate ESG data into financial decision making, which I think is, as Michael was saying, that's mainstream. That's just doing your job, right? If there's data that will help you understand the financial performance of a company, you should be looking at it to make financial decisions. And so that is, the next kind of iteration, but again, hopefully what is coming very much into the mainstream. Where I think the future lies, and Nathan was getting to this a bit with the scenario description of scenario planning, is thinking about the systems. And I think if we want to be serious about our impact and about sustainability, we have to deal with complexity, and we have to be able to think about the systemic impacts of different approaches and different business models, different investment approaches. And I think if we can't do that, we're going to just live by the laws of unintended consequences, or best case, we'll see incremental change, but we won't possibly be able to meet the challenges that we face. And so that is, I think that kind of leads us to where we are now, and how we have to think about both how we address the coronavirus that we're in the middle of, but also how we think about what we want to look like on the other side of it.
And could I ask you, the word impact investing, it started out very much as private investments. It was kind of a private equity notion. Has it now broadened it? Can we talk about impact in public equities, in fixed income, and in other areas, other asset classes?
So again, I would say this is something Domini has always done, sought to have an impact, and it's because we have a variety of tools that we deploy. One of them is integrating ESG into our investment decisions, but we also proactively seek to allocate capital to projects that we think are beneficial, so like infrastructure, municipal finance, looking for opportunities to finance projects that are not always the first thing, like to address capital gaps. And then I'm the director of engagement. So we have a very active program where we engage companies directly. We engage with investor coalitions and self-regulating organizations and that sort of thing, like SASB, like UNPRI, and we have an active voice in policy as well. So we're really working on a lot of fronts to have that impact, not just in our allocation decisions, but much more broadly in the policy and corporate spaces. So hopefully a lot of folks on the call, are folks that we'll be working with in the audience.
And Kat, to go on from there.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that at RBC, we believe that the fixed income markets are the most clear place to have an impact, because you can measure who gets the dollars and what they're for, specifically the benefits, the beneficiaries, and the use of proceeds. So as both Corey and Michael highlighted, in a municipal bond, you can finance a general obligation bond or a clean water bond. Both of those are municipal bonds, but in one case, you're specifically funding a project that has a climate implication, for example. And those you can buy mortgages for low to moderate income families, or you can buy general mortgages in the population. And so the fixed income markets are from our perspective at RBC, much more readily enable impact investing over equities, where you're a shareholder and you can have, as Corey says, an impact from an engagement perspective, but it's easier to do it in fixed income, where you know the use of proceeds and the beneficiaries.
And let's circle back to that. Michael's very much involved in those sort of assurances around fixed income in terms of green, social, and sustainable bonds. Just wanted to check, do we have Ray on the line with us? I got an email from him saying that he was trying to dial in.
Unfortunately not.
Okay, thank you. We'll carry on. Now let's turn now to kind of our second part of the discussion and the impact of COVID-19. I'll start with you, Kat. And really I think something that is surfacing is that the balance of E, S, and G has really shifted and much more focus on the S. Could you talk about what you're looking at, what you think has changed in terms of the world's lens on ESG? You're on mute, Kat. Could you unmute?
Thank you. I don't know that it's changed. I think there's a repositioning of the emphasis. So as Neil said when we were making sure we all knew how to use this system, we all thought 2020 was going to be the year of the environment, the E part of the E, S, and J. And what's come to the fore is that it's really so much more the S that we're concerned about in the midst of the pandemic that we're all living in. And that S has sort of resonates for a lot of reasons. The first one is that at a simple level, we are all recognizing unskilled, what we used to call unskilled workers, who are the ones who are bringing us our food and allowing us to social distance appropriately. And we see the role that different kinds of people are playing in delivering. There's also a the shift to do people focused on, are companies furloughing employees, or are they guaranteeing them employment and job security in the midst of very uncertain times? We look at who's paying extra pay to those essential workers and valuing the contribution they're making. And also from a social perspective, are they contributors to the community? Have they changed their business models to be responsive to the needs of the community by shifting to create proper PP&E for the healthcare crisis, or by responding to their local communities in some way? All of these things are factors, and this really drives profitability. The most significant example of that is the need for human capital to be responsive, and the importance of workers that can be flexible and adjust to the change. Teachers going to online, companies getting people to work from home, retooling to meet those PPE needs. All of these require good human capital, good talent, and the ability to respond on a dime, quite frankly, to these changes. And so that is driving more of the S, the social aspect, both from the human capital perspective and also the societal contributions.
Do you think this is going to be a permanent change in how we look at companies and how companies behave? I mean, certainly we get the sense that what companies do now will be judged for years to come, but will there be a permanent shift in your, as an investor, your emphasis on human capital?
Absolutely, absolutely, and that's because I think the way people are responding are going to stay in our minds for a very long time. We're going to remember the company that is giving the wedding gown maker that's giving wedding dresses to the healthcare workers, or the companies that are announcing these job security or pay raises for essential workers. And one of the things that's been driving ESG as a value proposition is really that customers really care, and they're voting with their dollars. I joke that, if you look at the ads at what we used to call the Super Bowl, and maybe someday we'll see it again, that they're really talking about being good companies, because people want to be aligned with good companies. And COVID-19 has made it much more important for the consumer, for the employee, for the shareholder, and even for the suppliers and vendors to feel that they're dealing with good companies. Good in the broadest sense of the word, and not meaning to be judgmental, but responsive and resilient and involved.
Great point. Yeah. So thinking beyond your workforce, but also your supply chain, really, really crucial. Now, one of the things you mentioned last week, Kat, that you were sick and tired of hearing of the problems, you wanted to start hearing about solutions. And Corey, you echoed that, saying it's essential now to put solutions in front of this audience of sustainability officers. And you have organized an investor statement on the response of business to coronavirus. Very important statement. What is the message to companies?
Well, so I think it picks up on what Kat was just saying. And so I want to kind of give you a little theoretical framework before I say what's in the letter, because I think there are, and the signatories do come at this from a number of different places. And so, when we think about what matters, I mean, it's in this moment, it's very easy to be very moved by the circumstances and the plight that so many people face, whether it's the grocer in our own communities or it's the garment worker that is now without a paycheck and is walking 100 kilometers home with no prospect for how they're going to take care of themselves during a lockdown. So this is a moment where it's all very acute, and it's easy to kind of care about these things for companies, but I think we need to, as a financial community, build this into our thesis in a more fundamental way. And so, kind of building what I said earlier, there's the traditional approach of what moves the share price up and down, right? And that's, to be fair, that's what sell side analysts look at. And that's kind of where their research often stops. What's going to move the price in the next 12 months? I think we can go a layer deeper and see where ESG data actually matters to performance. So that's you pollute the river and it turns into a real legal risk or reputational harm that actually materializes. And you can go a step further, though, and this is where I hope we can kind of take this conversation to say, maybe you realize that you needed the river for your own sake. Maybe you polluted the river and now you have a supplier downstream who can no longer provide a key input to your business. And that's the kind of level of understanding that I'm hoping we can get to in this conversation. And so, and when we look at that in this environment, we see that playing out very much in real time. There is the kind of very conventional understanding of the human capital risk of, let's say, laying off all of your employees in response to a market shock and then having a very long and difficult road to bring them all back on when you need to resume operations. Or similarly, you pay out huge bonuses based on 2019 performance and get a lot of mud on your face because you at the same time laid off a ton of workers. And so that can really affect the reputation of a company and affect and have a material impact in the traditional sense of the word. But you also could see the deeper, maybe something more deep into the supply chain that is going to affect operations, your ability to resume and resume normal operations when that's possible. And so the investor statement, I think, hits on all of those levels. So what we did is we co-led a statement that organized investors actually from around the world. We're really, really pleased. We have over 300 signatories with over 9 trillion assets in management. And we have signatories from every continent, signatories managing assets from $50,000 in a faith-based fund to over $1 trillion with some really significant global asset managers. And I think they come from different perspectives on this, but all to the same place where we try to recognize the difficult situation that everyone faces and recognize the context we find ourselves in. And then we put forward 5 recommendations and say, look, recognizing the context and those limitations, we hope you'll consider these 5 things and do what you can. And those 5 things were to make paid leave available, to prioritize health and safety in the workplace, to maintain employment where that's feasible, and to maintain customer and supplier relationships, which gets at both the viability of the value chain and also some of the humanitarian issues I just mentioned, for example, in the garment sector. And then finally, financial prudence, which raises the issues of executive compensation and doing share buybacks at a time when you're getting perhaps government support and cutting other spending.
Okay, good. So some solid advice to companies, or asks really of companies. Turning to PRI, and Nathan, PRI has asked investors to support sustainable companies through this crisis, perhaps even if that limits short-term returns, but also to hold them accountable. Some of the things that Corey just talked about, really around social issues. What are the PRI signatories telling you about the crisis? What are they focusing on in their to support their portfolios? I think you're on mute, Nathan. On mute.
Thank you. Well, a lot of them, especially on the pension side, are dealing with liquidity issues and having to pay out benefits. But at the same time, having lower reserves in their funds or lower prospective returns. So we've got to remember that a lot of the ultimate institutions holding assets on behalf of beneficiaries are being squeezed at the moment too through this crisis, and there are human stories there that we need to remember. If you put aside sort of those same short-term liquidity pressures, I think a lot of the investors were wondering how to participate well through the current AGM season, for example. Now, in the past, online AGMs have presented both some opportunities and some concern to many in the responsible investment community. But we tried to encourage investors to work with online AGM procedures this AGM season, even though we all recognize there's a very important accountability moment around the AGM. And if we're going to start moving to electronic formats, we need to think about how those are maintained. But we encourage investors to do that. I think perhaps more controversially or more in a more difficult issue, we actually raised the prospect of investors accepting lower dividends through this period. Now, this is a very challenging issue, let's face it. And now sometimes investors have no choice in this situation. Companies are being really stretched and have genuine solvency issues that they need to address immediately, and so it's clear. But in some other cases, there are questions about whether or not a company on one hand can respond to some of the labour practice asks that Corey has just made, that we fully support, and what implication that might have on the cash flow of the business and potential distributions. Now, these are hard trade-off questions, and we encouraged PRI signatories to try and take as long-term a perspective as possible in these situations. Now, in some markets, the financial regulators came even in more clearly than PRI. So in the UK, for example, the central bank essentially told the banking system to back off on dividend payments because protecting the stability of the employment of the workforce was an important issue. So in some markets, you know, the message has been much harder than the one we've given, but we have tried to take on some of these very challenging issues in this time, even though the investor sector is also under pressure, to try and encourage investors to signal support to companies to honour these labour circumstances and to work with companies on the income streams that flow from those companies to investors over time. So there are some of the issues. We've also, I think, importantly, suggested to investors that they might have to back off on some company engagement issues right now, because companies are dealing with genuine short-term pressures. And even though we care very much about the consistency of the approach on ESG issues, not all companies are going to be able to engage with us successfully on a broad suite of ESG issues right at this moment. And so some prudence, I guess, and sensitivity to company circumstances right at this moment is important. And I guess the accountability side of this is, let's make sure we're paying attention that companies are not using this moment to take decisions that we wouldn't support from a sustainability or ESG perspective. And so attention and scrutiny is also needed. And that's the flip side of that coin of trying to work with companies in their situation. And so they're the types of issues that we've been discussing with investors. And we know that they're challenging, but investors have been trying to follow this approach.
Excellent. So real leadership from PRI throughout this, and a very important organization, now over 90 trillion represented in AUM, right? Let's go on to Michael. And you know, it's too bad that BlackRock wasn't able to join us today. They put out a really good report this week on the performance of ESG strategies in the crisis, and showing that ESG funds have outperformed in this crisis, not just in this crisis, but in past ones as well. And also noted that they've seen inflows. Michael, have you seen that? You know, in the bull market with ESG booming, the skeptics warned that as soon as there was a downturn, you'd see outflows. Have you seen clients maintain or even increase their interest in ESG strategies?
Yeah, it's been really encouraging to say that through all this crisis, through what our clients have been going through, which is a lot. We noted before on our institutional clients who have managed large pensions, or insurance clients, or other institutional clients, they've increased their interest in ESG. And that's not just on social issues, which is definitely increased in its level of focus, but also continuing their climate commitments, really taking maybe what they say as an organization and translating that into their portfolio. And it's been fascinating because internally, we've had our team say, we are shocked that you are moving forward as to the clients that they're moving forward. And they said, well, why? This is what we have to do at this point. We need to show tangible evidence that this is not just something that we do when times are well, or when it's easy. We do this when times are tough. And I think the performance, some of the short-term performance on these issues through this crisis have helped them kind of cross that barrier maybe that was holding them back. I think what's also been quite compelling is the fact that they are seeing that the issuers, hopefully, there's a dichotomy. There's those issuers who have now committed to emerging from this crisis with sustainability in mind, whether that be environmental, social. We shouldn't forget governance. You could have a great environmental plan or social plan, but the people running that, if they don't know what they're talking about, it doesn't have a lot of good. We are seeing that ability to take almost a desire to build a sustainable portfolio, in some cases an impact portfolio or thematic. We're seeing the ability to actually build up a portfolio in a way that matches what a client needs. And I think that that's helping build that taxonomy of sustainability, SCGs. What does it mean to have a sustainable issuance? It requires engagement. So I would say, to Nathan's point, we have to be mindful of what we're engaging on. We have to be mindful that there is still that opportunity for engagement, but it needs to be focused on factors that are material, especially right now.
Excellent, Michael, thank you. And we're getting questions coming in from the audience. I want to make sure we have time to get to those. I'll race ahead a little bit and start to talk about the recovery, look to the future. And just to go to you again, Nathan, are you seeing signs that the recovery will be sustainable and inclusive? Will we be building back better?
Yeah, it's very important to distinguish here that governments are rightly focusing on a rescue phase to try and maintain jobs and liquidity. And that's sensible. And that's a question of keeping the financial system afloat, keeping companies afloat, different approaches in different countries, appropriate to their circumstances. I think governments now are starting to turn their mind to a sort of medium-term, some people use the word stimulus, some people use the word recovery phase, where you might be trying to encourage companies to rebuild their productive and operational capacity in order to encourage employment growth, to encourage economic growth. And there's a very important set of decisions that governments are going to have to make here. And we're seeing different approaches around the world. So to go to your question, we are seeing examples where, mainly rhetorical at this stage, I'd say, before we see the hard numbers, but there are some firm examples of governments attempting to build in social and environmental criteria into public financing packages. Now, we actually had an announcement yesterday in Europe, and forgive me, I will try and give a couple of examples from around the world, but the European ones are quite interesting. The first, we know that there was a bailout package for Air France offered by the French government. It came with a requirement for a net zero emissions reduction plan from the airline over 30 years. We all know how tough that is in the airline industry, but nonetheless, that was a condition of the package. Also in Germany, and France yesterday announced a 500 euro package, and in it that they signaled that they were going to, they reconfirmed the commitment to tightening the 2030 emissions reduction target for Europe to from minus 40% to minus 50%, and that they were going to reform the EU trading scheme, emissions trading scheme, and develop sectoral green transition roadmaps for each of the high emitting sectors that they were going to create as criteria as part of this 500 euro recovery package. And so these are indications that governments, at least, well, this is European examples. I think there's a couple of interesting examples from Canada as well. Governments are going to see if they can do two things at one time. And I think there's an interesting US-Europe question here as well from an investor's perspective. We're just about to flood our economies with public money again. And a lot of that money is going to rebuild productive capacity in the economy, which is going to last a decade or more. The question is, will these packages refloat economic practices of the past, or will they start to encourage and accelerate the transition on these ways of working socially and these environmental performance levels that we know need to be part of our economy in this sort of 10 to 20 year horizon? And there's a really interesting inflection point here we might have a US market which invests in the old economy, and we might have a European market which makes at least some of this money available for the future economy. From an investment point of view, we're going to get a divergence in the strategy around economic redevelopment and recovery, and you're going to get a bigger subsidy in Europe to green industry effectively. So this is going to create both some interesting risk and risk return questions for investors, but it's also going to create some interesting economic development pathway questions for investors. And I think, again, may influence the way the investment community thinks about these two markets from an ESG perspective. So we're at a really interesting inflection point, and we are seeing some evidence that governments are going to try to do both, at least in some countries. I promised a Canadian example. I understand that the Trudeau government said that any company claiming sectoral bailout funds would have to commit to a TCFD report. Now, that's a lighter measure, of course, a disclosure measure, but it does signal that people are thinking about how we have to do two things at once here. I think that's quite important.
So it's interesting to see, as you say, there's a contrast with the US, and at least here in the US, we're seeing businesses come out and kind of asking for conditions. A major group of companies led by Ceres, I think, announced last week that they want climate to be part of any congressional bailout. And there was another announcement this week, a group of companies stating science-based goals for climate. Even now, in the middle of this, they're doing that. Kat, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I think I just wanted to broaden. I agree with everything Nathan said, but I want to broaden the lens into it a bit. This is probably not one crisis. It is not a pandemic, and then we solve the pandemic and we move on. This is a series of crises. It is a pandemic. It is an economic crisis. It is a food supply crisis, which is probably just around the corner. In many ways, certainly here in the U.S., it's a healthcare crisis that has shown the weaknesses. It is an inequality crisis. All of this has brought to light many of the issues that are fundamentally and systemic issues, and the environment is part of those series of crises that we are facing. They're not sort of future, but many of us feel that we have that crisis today. And I think the word is resiliency, and that the real key is how do we build in resiliency when we build back better. And I'm reminded of FEMA, which is our Federal Emergency Management Agency, that plays rescue when there's a flood or runs in when there's a hurricane, and realized a couple of years ago that they needed to change their model, that they couldn't constantly play rescue, especially as these environmental events were accelerating, that they needed to do things differently. and started to look at how could they help particularly cities and states build in resiliency. And this pandemic, this crisis we're in the midst of now, will highlight the need for resiliency, both at a governmental level, but also at a corporate level. And the corporate sustainability officer has a really important role here in focusing the organization on resiliency. I talked about human capital as being important because the question was, how resilient was that human capital? Could it make the turn on a dime? Could it readjust? And the issue is going to be resiliency going forward from our perspective, and will add value long term from an investment perspective if for those entities that can achieve it.
I'm glad you brought the role of the sustainability officer into this, Kat. Very important, and it's something I wanted to make sure we touched on. And let's go to Michael on that just quickly before we go to questions from the audience. But Michael, how can the sustainability officer make the case just now in this crisis and coming out of it that they really should be in the room? They should have a seat at the table where the decisions are being made. What are some of the issues that you think they should be talking about?
Yeah, the question is, are they allowed to have a seat at the table? Are they on the Outlook calendar invite when key decisions are being made, or are they told what the sustainability plan is in many cases? One of the things that we've done for quite some time in our engagement is when a company notes that sustainability is a key metric and they note let's say a specific target, we ask the CFO in our engagement without the CSO in the room, what is your sustainability plan? And if they can't, at least to some high level, tell us what that is, we probably know that this organization is probably not as an open and honest organization on other factors. So for us, that lack of collaboration, which I would say is quite pervasive, we have not bridged that gap fully yet. I think we're getting there. But I think that question is it should not be just the CSO in engagement, and it should not just be the CFO or the CEO. There really needs to be that collaboration together. I did want to note one thing on Nathan's point, as well as Catherine, on governments. We'd be remiss if we didn't note emerging markets and really just the level of pain inflicted on the market and the people in these areas. And I think it's quite remarkable when you look at the IMF. You think about how are we going to merge, or how are these governments going to merge, that you have the head of the IMF noting climate change. And I think she used the term harmful oil subsidies and inclusive growth and recovery packages. It would have been very easy to create bailout packages that said we need to only look at the current environment, what is needed now. But I think it takes a forward-looking, long-term view, which is, I think we're all here for the, hopefully long-termism is here to stay, to say that recovery needs to not just be for 1 or 2 years. To Catherine's point, this is not a flash crisis. We need to emerge from this stronger.
Excellent points, Michael. Thank you.
If I could just add something before we go to questions quickly, to pick up on a number of things that came up. First, I just want to highlight what Nathan said about asset owners and their beneficiaries, and what a difficult place they find themselves in, especially in the U.S., and how important it is to keep those beneficiaries' interests central in this. But I actually think that speaks even more to the need for this kind of systemic view, because so many of the risks and harms created by the lack of a systemic view fall on those working people who are supposed to be the beneficiaries of those investment plans. So I have the utmost respect for those funds and their mission, but I think that they, and many of them are leaders on this, so I take their lead often on how to address these issues, but the interest of their beneficiaries really demand a strong, holistic approach to addressing income inequality and climate change, because they're the ones that are going to face a lot of the harm. And to that point, we need to be able to do two things at once, whether it's governments, companies. You need the CSO in the room because you need to be able to address these things on multiple fronts at the same time. We can't just say, let's address climate change and we'll take down all the super majors. And in the US, that's like 10% of the workforce. So thinking that we're going to innovate our way out of this without coming at it in a very holistic way, we're going to create unintended consequences. And so, there's a lot of conversations around the just transition, and that's very challenging also. But again, if we don't take that big picture view and look at the full scope of the impact, we're going to miss out, and we're going to create other problems that we have to solve down the line. And I think this is evidenced again by, the current climate crisis, the pressure on habitats is a reason that pandemics can happen, right? Like, this is a zoonotic disease. I mean, there's many theories out there about the source of the disease, but we do know that pandemics can be spread when viruses jump from animals to humans, and that happens when there's a ton of pressure on their natural habitats. So these things aren't isolated issues that we can check off one at a time. We need an integrated approach to the solution. And so, I really, and to that point, cities can't be building their own resilience if they're giving away their budgets to tax subsidies and tax abatements. So, it's like these things are all integrated. The government can't be resilient without the companies, and the great thing you mentioned about Siri saying the government needs to help and the companies need to play their part. So it's really, the solution will take all of us. And that's just to speak to solutions for a second. We've had this other project that we've done for the last year on how companies can help create value for the forest system in particular. But the takeaways kind of are more generalizable than that. And companies that look for partnerships with governments, with other industries, with other companies, that's part of how they can create value. And we have a whole profile with 5 key characteristics, but that's a really important one, where you're going to look for opportunities to collaborate, because no one can solve any of these things alone. We need everyone at the table.
Just one note on the importance of the sustainability officer, because I want to drive that too. This is not, there's a values piece to this, but there's a real value piece, a real value driver here. And in doing some research and thinking about this panel, I think the sustainability drives return. And just one fact that I picked up is that the NYU Stern School did a study and found that from 2013 to 2018, products marketed as sustainable grew 5.6 times faster than other products, 5.6 times. And I believe that if that was the case through 2018, if you look forward, it's going to be more important, because the social awareness, the concern about sustainability and the way back to how companies have behaved in this time is going to be more important to the consumer probably going forward than it has been in the past. So the sustainability officer is critical to keeping a focus on the value proposition for the company as an economic driver, and that should not be forgotten.
Good, great point, Kat, thank you. All right, now listen, we do have questions from the audience. Let's try to take some of these. And Michael, maybe you could field this first area. We actually had several questions around human capital metrics. Emily Hanning asked, what are the workforce human capital metrics that you see as material right now? And I didn't make this next one up, but do we need more standard approaches? Coming from SASB, I would want to ask that. But and someone else asked, Sabrina Wakens asked just more generally about how do you use materiality, the word materiality. So how do you measure and put value on the quality of good people was another related question. So we got a whole raft of questions on this similar area, but maybe you could address this. Human capital metrics, it can be hard to put numbers on.
Yeah, so maybe I'll focus on one sector just so we can kind of speak to something specifically. With the current administration, OSHA reporting for worker safety has vastly diminished. There are not the same stringent requirements for reporting this issue electronically. And so certain industries are reporting their worker safety. They are, and others are not. We can't find the data. And so if a subset of these institutions are not reporting their data, it is our obligation to engage. It is our obligation to engage because usually, I'm a recovering research analyst who worked on restructurings and bankruptcies, and it's typically the case, just like when my kids don't tell me something, it's probably bad. So in our case, if they have something positive to say, I actually think this is pervasive. If their goal is to be sustainable, then even when they make mistakes, they're actually not likely to hide them. They're actually, we actually see this, highlight the mistake, note how they're going to propose some type of application, not a plan only, but actually how they're going to implement that plan, so that it's not just a data point that sits somewhere where we're trying to get, but it actually becomes part of that company's plan. There will be accidents. There will unfortunately be even worse issues, especially with the current crisis. Question is, what are they doing about it? How is that sustainability in terms of how they treat their workers, hopefully consumers as well? How is that pervasive in terms of the way they do their business?
Great point. And I don't know if anyone else wants to come in on human capital and human capital metrics.
Yeah, we've been involved in the Human Capital Management Coalition for a long time, which led a engagement with the SEC, and there's been a lot of different work around this, but we've coalesced in that coalition around 4 metrics that we think are universal, and that's the size of the workforce, and that's broken down by part-time, full-time, independent contractor, subcontractor, et cetera. The total cost of the workforce, turnover metrics, and workforce diversity data. If you want a broader set of metrics, the Workforce Disclosure Initiative has a really robust framework that many companies are already reporting to. I think that's a great reference point. I'm working with SASB on a project underway that will, I think, also speak to that question. And to the question about materiality, I think just briefly, as investors, I really, not to belabor my point about the kind of systems approach, but materiality, we still look at it as a company by company issue when there are issues that are clearly material to our portfolio that may never quite manifest at the security level. And so I think we need an understanding of materiality of issues at our portfolio level. I mean, we know we could take it out a level further to the whole market, but what are the issues that are material to my whole portfolio? And let's say, carbon emissions, or if you have something that's heavily exposed to retail, the turnover metric is something that would be very important, or perhaps diversity data, and where are your risks in terms of equal pay and diverse workforce. And as a last example, tax, what's your tax practices? And if I could look at that at a portfolio-wide basis and see what the geographic exposure is to different tax and how much tax shifting is happening. So like if there was country-by-country reporting of tax payments for my whole portfolio, that would allow me to analyze both where there are risks and if I'm over or underexposed, and also if I'm systematically underpaying in a certain geography where I also invest in munis. There's a risk there, an overlapping risk, and a potential that I am creating a risk with practices in my equities portfolio that might manifest in my fixed income portfolio. So I think we need to be able to get a little more flexible with our definition of materiality.
That's very interesting, I think, for this audience of sustainability officers to hear how you as an investor look at this range of different metrics in your portfolio. I think that'll really help inform their conversations, their engagement with you. Kat, you were going to add.
Just very quickly, we also care what employees are saying about their company. We read Glassdoor. Are employees happy? What's the quality of the work environment? All of those things. So the voice of the employee is also important here, and not just what the corporate entity is reporting, but what the people are saying.
Let me ask you a somewhat related question, Kat. RBC came into this year, 2020, vowing to make board diversity an issue at AGMs. Is it still as important considering all that's happened just in these last few months?
100%.
All right. You want to expand on that?
All the reasons to do it are the same today as they were before. The importance of diversity on boards, the importance of recognition, the thought diversity that it brings. All of those things are important. And last year we upped our commitment that there needed to be 2 women on boards. We had a specific gender requirement, and that we would vote against the nominating committee if it wasn't. So a big issue for us, and nothing's changed.
And I
again,
think,
I'm just going to go ahead, Michael.
I think this is a great area where fixed income and equity can collaborate. I think for us that have these shared platforms, knowing what the voting records are, knowing what the issues are, And then even there are obviously entities within fixed income that don't exist within equity. That doesn't mean that they shouldn't be engaged on this topic. And so that's something that we've really tried to take from, really balance off of our equity counterparts in terms of the way they vote. But there are entities, especially geographically, that don't really get engaged on this issue. They don't have votes against boards if there's no diverse representation. And we've taken that a step further in order to bring that to a market that's quite honestly been, I would say not fortunate, but has not been engaged or pushed on this issue yet.
Looking ahead to off-season engagement with companies this fall and to next annual meeting season, is executive pay going to be a flashpoint? Does anyone want to chime in on that? I mean, Kat, what do you think? Is executive pay going to be in your meetings this fall for companies that maybe were still paying out millions when their employees were being laid off?
I think it has to be.
Yeah, okay. One last question for you, Nathan, that came in from the audience, and that is, I don't know if this is impolitic or tricky to ask, but there was just a simple question. Are US investors valuing ESG now to the same level as Europeans? That came in from Bart Kellerman. And of course, that presupposes the point that in the past, I think it was widely acknowledged that Europe was ahead in terms of ESG, both in the corporate and investing side. How does it look now?
Yeah, I think the interesting thing about the US market is that there is the level of diligence on integration and looking for investment signals out of ESG issues. I think that's the strength of the US market. We're seeing that movement, if you like, or that approach grow in the US. So when you say, are US investors valuing it, US investors are getting it. US investors are investing in their capacity to understand it, and they're very diligent on trying to find investment signals. I think the interesting thing about this COVID crisis is that we've just had a very substantial S-related system shock. These types of diseases were in the WEF, World Economic Forum, top 10 possible disruptive events. But did we do sufficient financial modeling around the possible volatility that would result and genuine economic losses that would result if that event came to fruition? And I don't think we did yet. This is not just a US issue. The Europeans didn't model it out the way they possibly could have either. So I think the point is we've all got a lot to learn here, and a lot of advancements in the way we build our capacity to respond to these issues. Not everything's going to be a big shock, of course, but this is an interesting moment. There is a good approach in the US that's very focused on understanding how these factors can affect financial returns, and we encourage that approach to develop and grow as much as possible.
Excellent. A hopeful note to end on. Thank you very much to our panelists, Corey Klemmer from Domini Impact Investments, Catherine Banat, RBC Global Asset Management, Michael Kashani from Goldman Sachs, and Nathan Fabian from the PRI. It's been a real pleasure talking to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Neil.
And lastly, thank you, Neil, for moderating the discussion. Just quickly from me, again, thank you to our panelists. Next up, we've got a webinar next Thursday at 9 AM Eastern on financing a sustainable future with CFOs of Waste Management, Mars, World Gold Council, who are partnering with us for the webinar, and then also the Chief Sustainability Officer of Unilever. So please do watch out for the marketing on that. And thanks very much, and see you all soon. Thanks again.
Thanks all. Well done, Neil.
Thank you.